Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections. I am looking forward to this. This is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action. And today's guest is a Westerner, and I must admit, actually graduated from the same, not the same school, because his wasn't quite as good as mine, but okay, but from the same city in Regina, Saskatchewan, and is now heading up a denomination called the Apostolic Churches of Pentecost. And so I'm going to let him introduce himself and just tell us a little bit of his own ministry journey. And so here is Wes Mills. Okay, that's half the introduction. Take it away, Wes.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Good to be with you here today. And we still have that hometown rivalry between colleges, or high schools. Although it's been a long time since either of us were there.
I'm graduated. This is my 50th year since I graduated. Not to let our audience know anything, but yeah.
No. Well, I did grow up in the Regina Apostolic Church. That was my home church as a boy growing up, and God gave me a love for the church in that context, and I felt a call to ministry at a young age, and so served that church as a lay youth pastor for several years, and then Went off to Eston College, where I know you're participating these days, and after graduation from there, went to Edmonton and became part of a church called the Seventh Avenue Apostolic Church. And I was just reflecting that it was 40 years ago this May that I began vocational ministry as a youth pastor there in Edmonton. So that's hard to believe, and to realize how much time has gone on, but that's the reality. So 40 years ago, so started off in youth ministry, and then moved into an associate role, and then eventually became pastor. And then part of that pastoral role involved leading that church to replant itself from a downtown kind of core into a suburban area. So that was a unique opportunity, and God blessed that opportunity and had great memories from that. I always said that those are probably some of my favorite memories from pastoral ministry was that season of transition where we saw a lot of people getting saved and a lot of people being baptized, and I dedicated more children than I can count hardly just in that season. So God really blessed, and I've always said Joni Mitchell was right. Sometimes you don't know what you got till it's gone. And
yes, good old Saskatoonite. Yeah, okay.
There you go. There's
a little more rivalry going on there.
Yeah. So, and from there, I came to the ACOP International Office as Director of Administration and Finance, and did that for I think it was 6 years. And then when the previous moderator, we call it president now, but the previous moderator, when he retired, I was elected to serve in the role of president. That was 2004. So again, 17 years in this role. So that's kind of my journey in an abbreviated, encapsulated way.
Well, I must admit the fun part of this of talking with you is also realizing that you're a bit of the historian of the ACOP, and you teach classes and do all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Can you give just a very short blurb about the denomination and where it started and how? Yeah, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. Well, our denomination, came out of we trace our roots back to the Azusa Street revival in 1906, where our founder, went down there. Franklin Small was impacted greatly by the Holy Spirit and came back to Winnipeg, Canada, and began to see the same kind of spiritual phenomena that was happening in Azusa Street began to happen in Winnipeg. So a great season of revival where many people came to faith in Christ, and hundreds of people were healed and empowered by the Spirit, and just a real sense of outpouring of the Spirit. And then from there, people went from there out to other places and planted churches and established ministries, went as missionaries globally. So it kind of all traces its roots back to what we call Zion Apostolic Apostolic Church. So this is actually our 100th anniversary. So it was 1921 that the denomination was established. And, since then it's, we've morphed a little bit. We amalgamated with another group in 1954 called the Evangelical Churches of Pentecost. So two groups that were kind of like-minded and about the same size came together and formed the denomination that exists today. So that's kind of our history. And again, it's like all histories, it has its checkered moments, and it has its great times of God's blessing and God's favor, and other times we just rather not talk about that.
Okay, well, we'll leave those aside.
And I know that every denomination has that. So
yes. Let me ask you a question. The base, starting in Winnipeg. Is a large part of the base Canadian, or how would you describe the?
So in fact, we're almost exclusively Canadian. A lot of movements began in the U.S. and then came into Canada. Ours is a little different. Our founder was a Canadian, and the movement started here. And we had a global impact in missions over the years, but we haven't had a strong American connection. We have a couple of churches that relate to us in the States, but it was more Canadians going to the US than it was Americans influencing back into Canada. So we're a bit unique in that way, that we are predominantly Canadian.
And within Canada, would you describe it as a lot of large churches, a lot of small churches, medium? How would you describe the composition of the churches?
Well, I did some thinking about that the other day, Ron. I think about 50 or 60% of our churches would probably be under 100 people. And then we'd probably have another, group of 25 to 30 churches that would be from, the 100 to the 250, and then probably another 10% over 250 and upwards. So our largest church would be the Regina Apostolic Church, and I think they consider around 1,200 people part of that assembly. So, but we're predominantly, smaller churches.
Now you're leading the denomination. And with that in mind, what have you been able to provide small churches with? How are you able to assist small churches in their ministry?
Yeah, well, we recognize that small churches are different than urban churches, or not, and I shouldn't make that divide, but many of the smaller churches are in rural or smaller communities, and not exclusively, but that would be one of the characteristics. There are definitely city churches that are smaller churches as well. But when I think of small churches that, that make up our fellowship, many of them are in smaller communities across the western part of Canada, Saskatchewan and Alberta. And, one of the things that's happened in some of those communities is that the communities themselves are either shrinking or disappearing just because of the way, life and business and farming has evolved over the years. So those small communities are often dissipating. So it's unique. So we recognize that they're different. We also recognize that smaller churches are almost like an extended family, in many ways. And sometimes they're literally a family where there's 2 or 3 families that are related and have a strong influence in the church. So that creates dynamics that are a little different than what you'd see in other churches that are larger. And so we recognize that. And so working with smaller churches, we find that they aren't looking for us to tell them what to do. They've got a pretty good sense of that, but they do look to us for support on, technical things. How do we relate to the government? How do we fill out the T3010 and all those kinds of things that we can get involved in. So, we find that our role is to be supportive, to be a resource, and to be, a place where pastors and churches can turn to when they need advice. And, our role has always been to influence the relationship and not to be directive necessarily in how those churches should function.
I think that as a denomination, you're a good example for us of Canadian small church ministry type of things as to how we can look at approaching working with each other as churches and as denominations. Do you have any thoughts on some of that collaboration and cooperation, how that can work effectively?
Well, I think that smaller churches are often more willing to cooperate than larger churches because they realize that we need each other and that we're better together. And so, some of our larger churches could support a missionary family or two and send them out. But most of our smaller churches couldn't do that. So coming together, working together cooperatively, on missions or other kinds of projects just makes more sense to some of our smaller churches than it does to our larger churches. So in many respects, I find that our smaller churches are more strongly engaged with us as a denomination than our larger churches are sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and let me venture then into the COVID thing, where cooperation or understanding what's going on has become a very big thing. How have you, as a denomination and within the denomination, how have you coped with the whole COVID thing?
Yeah. Well, it's been interesting because I think COVID has brought out the best and the worst in churches. And, some of the worst are the conspiracy theories that get shared around and those kinds of things. But I also have observed that many churches have pivoted, the word that we've all loved to hate, but have pivoted, in order to continue to function in their communities. And so, one of the things that I've observed, Ron, is that our larger churches that have people maybe with a skill set that would allow the church to have a very professional production of their Sunday experience, they've done well at that. But what I've discovered is that a lot of our smaller churches have said, we're going to do church on Zoom so we can see each other's faces. So it's not so much about the production quality as it is about the opportunity to connect, at least virtually, in some way. So I've just kind of made that observation. That's interesting. What the values that are reflected. Large churches have the value of quality and excellence, whereas smaller churches, the higher value is more relationship and connection.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just give a little bit of my experience here. In this last year, I have joined a group in Ontario and become part of their new church plant. Very interesting that, you do everything, most things on Zoom, but sometimes there's live meetings because they're allowed off and on.
Right.
But the leadership of that church actually includes people in Saskatchewan, because it's been formed online basically, because that's all you could do.
Right.
Do you find some very creative approaches that small churches are using nowadays to work, to be members, to work together? What are some things that you're finding?
Yeah, I don't know that we have that, although I do know that some of our pastors, for example, a couple of pastors in New Brunswick have their services on. So if you live in the West and you can get up in the morning and you can watch a service before you go. So in some respects, it's helped our churches connect with one another because they're able to go on and see John or Ken or whoever it is that's preaching in New Brunswick at 7 o'clock in the morning Alberta time, and but there's a sense of connection, and so I watch the comments that get posted and whatnot, and there's just an engagement, across the country that would never have happened had it not been for COVID and had not all of us been forced to do something virtually. So it is unique in that way, and I think some of those things are positive things for us. So, we can look at the negative, but I think that's positive. It's created a sense of connectedness. One of the things we did early on in COVID was we did a global prayer meeting and invited all of our partners around the world to join us. And, that was a really neat experience. And we wouldn't have thought of doing that had it not been for COVID and had it not been for the context we found ourselves ministering in.
Now, as a denomination and as a leader of the denomination, where do you see the ACOP going? And particularly for small churches, what do you see is there a vision for what's happening? That's a very wide open question, Wes.
Sure.
I'll let you go at it.
Well, you know, one of the things that we've focused on, Ron, is we think that churches need to be healthy, and that's not determined by size.
Mhm.
Or location. That's determined by, you know, a number of other factors. And so we think that there can be healthy small churches. And so our desire is to help all of our churches be healthy, and out of that health then comes effectiveness. And so, you know, we recognize that, you know, a church in a town of 1,000 people is not going to grow to a church of 500, but they can still be effective and they can still be healthy in their context. So our goal is to help all of our churches to be healthy and effective. So, and we recognize that in smaller churches, they're not staff driven, they're volunteer driven. So, you know, they might have a full-time pastor. They might not even have a full-time pastor. The pastor might be co-vocational even. But we find that churches that are driven by volunteers function differently than churches that are driven by staff. And so we recognize that, you know, that there's a difference in the way those churches function. And as I said earlier, you know, many times large churches function like small churches function like an extended family, where there's you know, people working together, and we understand each other in a different way that's more familial than in larger churches, which is a little more anonymous, where people don't know the person that sits across on the other side of the church, whereas a small church, everybody knows everybody. So there's a sense of familiarity there that, you know, is helpful, but it's also challenging sometimes because of history, and people have had a particular perspective on things and have not.
You're being very diplomatic, brother. Thank you.
Well, I just know that, you know, people have said things over the years, and they've kind of stood by those things. So there is a stronger sense of tradition in smaller churches, and that cuts both ways. That's good and bad. I mean, if a church annually does something, they annually do it, whether it's the fall supper or the Christmas musical or the Easter event, whatever it is. Those things are very sacrosanct to many smaller churches, whereas in larger churches, stuff comes and goes, and people come and go, and there's not that same commitment to tradition. And I'm not saying that in a positive or negative way, but just the fact that smaller churches do have a greater sense of tradition.
Okay, yeah, your last about 5 minutes have brought about 1,000 questions to mind here. The first one being is, when you think of a small church, what would be a healthy small church?
Well, I think, first of all, they need to be on mission and have a sense of what has God called us to do in this community. And obviously, you know, part of that's got to be reaching people for Christ. There's got to still be an evangelistic bent there. I think there also has to be, you know, a strong sense of community, where, you know, people are coming together in small groups or in some kind of a way where they are meeting together in a place where there's opportunity to share needs and to pray for one another and to minister to one another. I think those are a couple of things that need to be there. I think that, you know, engagement with the community is critically important for a small church. As if you're just a church at the end of the block and nobody knows you, that's not going to be very effective. But if your church members are encouraged to engage with their community, then the church gets known in the community, right? Yeah. So I think that, you know, sense of mission, sense of purpose, you know, on an unhealthy, and maybe that's a better.
Okay, maybe that's
an unhealthy one. The tacit mission of the church has become survival. So it's just get enough money to pay the pastor and pay the bills and keep the lights on, and that's an unhealthy context, an unhealthy situation. So to contrast, to say a church that has a sense of mission and purpose that they're focused on is, I think, critical to church health.
Okay, well, I'm going to leave with sort of, well, I got two last questions, okay. and then our time's up because it's going way too fast. The first question is, if you were to look across Canada, people, books that have been published, some resources, what are some that you would suggest for small churches, you know, whether it's even blogs or podcasts, books, whatever?
Well, That's one I'd have to think about that one a little bit.
Mhm.
But I will say this, Ron, that we are participating in the study that EFC is doing on small churches.
Right, yeah.
Because we felt like it would be helpful to resource churches with information about, how are other small churches working, and what's working for them, what's not. So we've decided we would invest in that, and hopefully produce some information that's going to be helpful to pastors of smaller churches. So
Yeah, we had fun in that Rick Heemstra did a podcast with us about a month ago, talking a little bit about the partial things that they've seen in that. Some great things coming out. Yeah.
No, I think that'll be a great resource for churches, going forward as that report gets published. So we're glad to be part of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. A last question. What advice would you give to someone who is considering going into small church ministry?
Well, I would encourage them, in the first year of their assignment, that they should spend a lot of time drinking coffee with people from the church and people from the community, and begin to understand the community. I think that it's easy for someone to take an assignment, go to a small church, and think they've got all the answers in their toolbox. But what they really need to do is go and listen and learn, understand the context that they're ministering in, and get to know people. And that would be the first step. I think to try to understand why a church does things in certain ways would be a really good step, as opposed to just coming in and saying, we're going to change this. So, and I find that, with smaller churches, that pastors need to build the relationships with people before, it's not their great preaching necessarily or their great oratory skills that's going to endear them. It's the fact that they went out and saw John and rode in his combine with him, for an afternoon, or they, went and they worked with somebody who was in the oil patch for, it's just getting to know people. And so the endearment comes from relationship, and not from necessarily the traditional ministry skills that we think about, preaching and that kind of stuff.
Well, this has been excellent. And as I say, we've got 2 of the 1,000 other questions that I'd like to ask you. Maybe we'll have to do this again, but I want to say very much thank you for joining us on This Is Us, Canadian Small Churches in Action. Thank you, Wes Mills.
Well, good to be with you, Ron, and all the best to all your listeners today.
Thank you.